Hi, everybody. My name is Sparrow Gates. I am a PhD student here at UCLA, and this is my project entitled Student Anxiety in the Writing Process. So today, first I'm going to give a brief positionality statement of sorts, and then we'll talk about student anxiety more generally speaking. We'll talk about culturally relevant pedagogy, and then we'll get into sort of the nitty-gritty of where instructors that I have been surveying find this kind of student anxiety to happen the most in their writing process, before sharing some of their success stories or potential solutions, and then giving some resources to hopefully help with the, quote unquote problem of student anxiety. Okay, so as I said, my name is Sparrow. I am a first generation student of the humanities. I was raised by a fierce single mother in rural Texas, excuse me. I have experienced higher education in religious studies programs. I went to divinity school for my master's, and then also now here, I'm becoming really adept at navigating Near Eastern language and culture programs. My research is particularly on ancient history and peoples, and it's informed by literary theory and sociolinguistics. So my work as an instructor is interdisciplinary with a focus on the humanities. But that said, the interdisciplinary nature means that we also have influence from and engagement with the social sciences, particularly linguistics and archaeology. That said, I also was diagnosed with generalized anxiety as an undergraduate after having panic attacks in class. I was actually studying abroad, and so I was also in a foreign country that didn't speak English. So that kind of was a rude awakening for me that maybe I have anxiety and should start to try to navigate that maybe more healthily. So that said, as well as being a first generation student and other things like a woman, other sorts of identities, I have a number of the identities that scholars have tried to associate or rather isolate as reasons for anxiety in the classroom. And we'll discuss that a little bit, but this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. And so I really relate to my students when I recognize that they're dealing with anxiety in the classroom, especially as that's something that I have dealt with a lot in the past as well. And pedagogical scholars also tend to focus on anxiety in the classroom, and when they do so, they try to isolate certain identities in order to approach maybe what the source of the anxiety is. And so in this presentation, hopefully we'll be able to discuss other kinds of student anxiety that aren't purely identity-based, but it's anxiety, so it's multivalent. That said, I've taught roughly 10 quarters of Writing 2 here at UCLA, which is a writing intensive seminar for undergraduate students. I'm also almost finished earning the UCLA graduate certificate in writing pedagogy. So that's part of what this project is for. Okay, so as I mentioned, I have noticed that student anxiety is sometimes treated in the literature, the research, and pedagogy as the enemy of the good. Now, there are a multitude of reasons for anxiety in the classroom, right? We hear about imposter syndrome a lot, especially in writing classrooms. You will hear people talk a lot about language barriers or students working in a language that is not their native language and the anxieties that that can kind of cause. There's also plenty of research out there on first generation and working class identities as being an identity, especially that struggles with things like hidden curriculum and trying to understand sort of college, generally speaking, academia at large, and who have none of that social support at home from their parents because they are first generation. So that's one common avenue that people have identified as a source of some student anxiety. But non-identity-based anxiety is just as common in my experiences, both as a student and as an instructor, right? So as I mentioned, I have diagnosed anxiety. That doesn't come from imposter syndrome, and it doesn't come from a language barrier. English is my first language. I am first generation and working class, but that isn't necessarily why I had panic attacks in school, right? So sometimes anxiety is just a fact of life, and it's not the enemy of writing. It's just a way of being. And so I'm really interested in understanding what more we could accomplish if we weren't concerned about how anxiety might ruin our instruction. And so understanding where this fear stems from for anxious types like myself might help us mitigate it in the classroom, whether that's through activities or certain kinds of assignments, etc. Okay, so first of all, I wanted to say that given how much of the research on anxiety centers identity, this is a huge, piece of the puzzle, and a natural first step to mitigating anxiety in the classroom at that broader level is introducing culturally relevant pedagogy. So some ways to easily incorporate this, according to the wonderful research, especially by Gloria Ladson-Billings and Florence Castillo. Their articles are a handful of their articles are listed in the resources at the end of this presentation. But some easy ways of incorporating this into the classroom include celebrating student interests and experiences as valuable to the classroom. Also really humanizing ourselves as instructors, making it clear that we are not their superiors. And we don't, just because we have this particular knowledge doesn't make us any better as a student or as a scholar or as a human than our students are. And making sure our students really feel that. And then really, really simple things like making sure to pronounce students' names correctly, making sure you're not continually mispronouncing particular kinds of names. That is, a very easy way to make a student feel uncomfortable in your presence. Another thing to do is to assign readings that engage these things, these kinds of issues, explicitly. So articles such as Should Writers Use Their Own Language by Vashana Shanti Young, She's Mosevich by Miriam Gurba, and Shitty for Stress by Anne Lamott. These, I have links to these at the end of the presentation as well, should you wish to read them or assign them to your students in the future. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit from the identity piece, as a person with medical anxiety, I am keenly aware of the fact that not understanding expectations is sometimes where my anxiety comes from. So understanding expectations helps mitigate my anxiety. Not knowing what to expect is the absolute worst for people with medical anxiety. And so you can only imagine people without medical anxiety who are dealing with anxiety for the first time. This is also going to be true for them as well. So some easy ways to incorporate this information into your lesson planning and sort of your syllabus or whatever is to rethink the design of your major assignments. So we can consider things like the DAPO framework. So if we're making sure to include clear directions, audience, purpose, learning objectives, and evaluation in the assignment prompt so that your students kind of have a really clear understanding of what your expectations are for the assignment. Another thing would be to consider adding more integrated scaffolding to better prepare students for the assignment, especially if there's a particular assignment you're noticing students deal with a lot of anxiety about surrounding. Then maybe we can strengthen the existing scaffold for that assignment or add more integrated scaffolding leading up to that assignment so that students are better prepared and have already perhaps gone through some evaluation with you as an instructor before reaching this more pivotal point in the quarter or semester. Another thing you can do is really start to analyze for yourself why and how you will grade the assignment the way you will, and make sure that you're articulating that to your students. If you really care about grammar and spelling, make sure that your students know that before they submit their paper. But if that's not something you're interested in, then maybe we drop that piece of the evaluation and we really articulate to our students what we care about in the grading process. And we're maybe more cautious about actually grading for what we're looking for, and what we've articulated to our students is what we will be evaluating. So again, giving your students that sense of a solid expectation for what evaluation will look like as well. Okay, so as I briefly mentioned at the very beginning, I took a survey of instructors from a couple different universities, but focused mainly at UCLA, to ask folks a variety of different questions regarding their experiences of student anxiety in the writing process. And one of the questions that I asked was, at which stage of the writing process do students have the most trouble with in your experience as an instructor, if any? And here are the results that I gathered. So clearly there is a strong sense that students struggle with the argument section of the writing process, as well as pre-writing and grading. So these are the three sort of subjects or stages of the writing process that we will be focusing on in this presentation. So For a little bit more clarity, this is how I defined each of these sections in the survey. So argument includes generating an argument or thesis statement, following and understanding the prompt, connecting sources to the argument and or integrating sources effectively. For pre-writing, we were discussing outlining, idea generation, and broader things like project intimidation. And then for grading, we are discussing assessment anxieties, concern for different TAs grading differently, and these kinds of things. So in order of importance, we will now sort of tackle these and see what these survey respondents had to say about what kinds of anxieties they're experiencing from their students and how they're trying to mitigate these anxieties in the classroom. So for argument, we noticed that student anxiety really surrounds generating a good or original argument. Original argument is something that often makes it into the prompt, and students sometimes struggle with what that means, what that might look like, especially at an undergraduate level in a humanities interdisciplinary course. Thesis statement is sort of a tie-in to that, right? But also things like following and understanding the prompt, which is huge for generating an argument, connecting your sources to your argument, or integrating the research that you've done, and then also justifying your argument. So being able to articulate why the argument is important, or giving the so what for the conclusion piece. So here are some quotes that I pulled. You'll see this on the next couple slides as well. But for example, Miranda Hugberg said, "We all have challenges coming up with coherent arguments that are the right size for the essay at hand." I like the way that she framed this because you can tell that this is not necessarily purely for undergrads or for our students, but this is information for us as well. And we also engage with the writing process with anxiety. So I think that connection is really important to notice. Here, Emily Frake says, students struggle to generate an original argument quite frequently, as well as finding the best evidence to support their thesis. So again, we see this fear that my argument won't be original, my argument won't be good enough because I don't know how to support it. Ethan Friedland mentioned that there is difficulty regarding sources critically and therefore producing analysis that isn't surface level or dependent on somebody else's argument. So again, this concern for originality and how much can be original and to me versus how much I need to be citing. This is a balance that causes students a lot of anxiety. And then Jacob Lang mentions the difficulty elaborating on the consequences and implications of their argument. So this is the justification of the argument piece, where students sort of freeze and maybe have trouble understanding how their argument fits into scholarly discourse, to what extent their argument is original or good, or why making the argument matters in the first place. So these are some of the student anxiety concerns that stem at the argument stage of the process. Really focused on originality and understanding the prompt as well. Understanding the prompt came up quite a bit in the survey. I don't have a good quote for it here, but the importance of understanding the prompt when tackling or generating an argument or a thesis statement cannot be understated. So making sure to really, really be clear about the prompt and again, what your expectations for what the argument might look like is really important here. And some things you can also do are incorporate, maybe provide for your students really good writing examples, samples of writing from scholars who do pieces of this really well, whether this is justifying their argument, you could provide an example of that, whether that's field specific, whether you want to show an example of like original argumentation. I'm sure that, you could find a piece of writing for that as well, just to see, show students how these things might look on the page and how other people have tackled these issues before. Also, just recognizing that this is an issue that even grad students face, even the PhD instructors at the front of the classroom are also facing this with regard to their dissertation or master's thesis or whatever it is, can also be really helpful for students to understand that this is part of the process and does not necessarily reflect on them as a good or bad writer or student. Okay, so now we're moving on to pre-writing. Here we have student anxiety really focusing on outlining, idea generation, and project intimidation, as I mentioned before. So Laurel Westrup says that pre-writing anxieties include lack of interest in or confident perspective on the assignment, as well as the fears that the way they were taught or tend to approach pre-writing is wrong. So again, we have this sense of like, maybe I'm not doing things correctly. And that can stem all the way to the pre-writing section, whether that's, again, just lack of interest in the material or lack of confidence in their perspective. I think that's a really important piece of Laurel's quote here. Emma Peterson mentioned that students tend to be perfectionists and put off the work for feeling that they may do a bad job, or worse. She goes on to say that the worst part is that they may not think that doing the work is valuable in the first place. It doesn't feel important, right? Again, there's this idea of not knowing how to situate yourself in the scholarly discourse and to what extent an original idea is possible and to what extent an original idea is important or worth arguing. So this confidence piece is really important, as we're seeing, and we'll see this throughout all of the different stages that we're discussing today. Ethan Friedland mentions that he often has to break them out of the mindset that, one, they have to trust everything that's in writing, and two, they're not qualified or allowed to think critically. So again, this piece of like, how much can be my personal voice versus how much has to be supported by citation or quotes from other scholars. And likewise, that these sorts of sources and things that we're analyzing here, we can also doubt those. We can disagree with scholars, things like this as well. So again, this also plays into this piece of student confidence with their writing and with what they have to say. Kay mentioned something that I felt very called out by because in my undergraduate experience, I was the student, but many students refuse to seek help until quite late in the game or at all. And so when they need help with their pre-writing phase, project intimidation, outline, idea generating, but that anxiety kicks in and there's that fear that the instructor will judge them for not doing pre-writing correctly, as Laurel mentions, then you might get your students sort of disappearing or procrastinating, which is a huge feature of medical anxiety, etc. So definitely paying attention to this and keeping in mind that students not asking you questions does not mean that they don't have questions, and making sure that you are available and that it doesn't seem intimidating to come ask you for these kinds of questions. Okay, now let's get into grading. So this is what we kind of consider the final piece in some ways. It's the last thing we do as instructors. We enter their grades into gradebook, right? So student anxiety around grading can manifest earlier in the writing process, or can manifest later in the writing process. So sometimes this happens in the revision stage. Sometimes grading anxiety happens even during the pre-writing phase. This is an anxiety that carries out throughout the process. And so it's a really important piece of the puzzle when it comes to being the instructor and trying to mitigate these things. But based on my survey, it seems to me that student anxiety typically surrounds assessment anxieties, fear of judgment, risk aversion, concern for different TAs, sort of grading differently, so subjectivity in grading, as well as sort of struggling with collegiate grading as opposed to their experiences of high school grading. So, for example, Kay White says, more than once I've had students who did not really understand the difference in grading scale and the meaning of feedback in a college classroom. So this is sort of maybe a piece of the hidden curriculum that we don't think to convey to our students very often, but it's worth maybe mentioning at the beginning of your class or your assignment that, you know, evaluation might look different from the way that they've been evaluated previous to this in high school. Kay also mentions in the survey that, you know, this particular student had high school teachers who thought if you did the work, you get full credit. And obviously in the college classroom, that is not often the case. And so conveying that to your students earlier on so that it's not like a surprise shock when they get their first graded piece back can be really useful. Again, setting expectations and making them very clear is really important. Ty Gates mentions fear of judgment. So people can be very protective of their writing and their ideas They view it almost as an extension of themselves. And so bringing it into critique and submitting it for grading can be really stressful. I absolutely identify with this, especially as a PhD student. There comes a time for some of us where our writing almost becomes tied up with our identity, and it becomes a piece of us, and it represents our ideas and our education and all of these things. And so again, submitting that for grading and the potential for someone to not like it or to grade it poorly, even when I've put this much work into it, is really scary. And that can be part of where some of this anxiety is stemming from. Laurel Westrup mentions that at the revision stage, students often feel hesitant to truly rethink what they've written. They become so wedded to an argument that isn't working because the fact that there is a thesis statement at all is a safety blanket. So Laurel here mentions anxiety about risk-taking, which translates to anxiety about grading. So here's an example of, at the revision stage, we've got this issue, but it's actually a concern for grading and evaluation. And you can sort of see how this grading piece, this fear, this anxiety surrounding evaluation can sort of retroject itself towards earlier stages in the writing process. This is really helpful, I think, especially when, teaching students and it's kind of difficult to see why they're so stuck on their thesis when it's not working for them. It could be an anxiety thing. It could be risk aversion, and it could be something that's seated primarily in evaluation and assessment anxiety. Emily Frake really sort of hits this point home when she says they align their worth with being a good writer, or, maybe some students need strong grades for grad school, med school, pre-law, whatever it is, and they're afraid a lower writing grade will prevent their future plans from happening. So this anxiety can really manifest itself, not just like whether or not I get a B on this one assignment in this one class, but whether or not I can pursue my future goals. So this is kind of the level of catastrophizing you might see with your students, and this is why grading becomes such a space for student anxiety. And again, if we can sort of mitigate this fear, this anxiety, and we can explain our evaluation strategies, what we're evaluating and why we're evaluating it, why it's important before they submit the assignment, then a lot of this fear can be sort of mitigated. Okay, this is a lot of text, so I apologize for that, but there were so many great things that people contributed to, the success stories section of the survey, things that people are doing that they are really proud of. So, for example, for students stuck on pre-writing and drafting, Emma Peterson takes a more encouraging and uplifting an approach to really get them to see the value of their work and gain confidence. Some of this also helps time management and things like that are very important pieces as well, of course. But the main contribution that Emma Peterson made was that confidence is really important here. And this is as early on as the pre-writing and drafting stages. I had one anonymous respondent say that their main strategy is to offer specific pointed help at every single stage of the writing process. I love this, especially because, as we've just discussed, assessment is a major piece of the anxiety puzzle. And so if you're getting consistent feedback at every stage, then students have a better understanding of expectations, etc., and how to improve for the next assignment. So telling your students you're willing to work with them. Not every student will take you up on the offer, but it can just help students to know that that's an option to come meet with you. But certainly that feedback piece is really important. Finally, I wanted to share Tara Prescott Johnson's success submission, basically assigning readings that address these insecurities and challenges head on. So this is where that piece that I mentioned earlier comes into play. This basically allows the students to get a reassuring you're not alone message while also learning about writing from really good examples. And these really good examples I want to mention are not necessarily traditional essay writing, but that doesn't mean it's not good examples of writing, right? So for example, Miriam Gerba's Chismosa Bitch and Vershana Shanti Young's Should Writers Use They Own English work consistently well for these purposes. Tara Prescott-Johnson also tries to build as much fun as possible into their classes and get the students to become friends. Because when they feel comfortable and safe, and when they feel that they belong and when they trust each other, it makes a huge difference, including at particular stages of the writing process, like peer review. So again, kind of at the bottom line, and this plays nicely with the culturally relevant pedagogy piece that we discussed earlier, making sure that students feel confident, safe, and like they belong in your classroom as a human goes a long way to mitigating anxiety. And then also just making sure that you're there at every step of the process and you're articulating your expectations to your students can be incredibly helpful. It's amazing how much we don't realize how much we don't communicate. So there's so much that goes into an assignment prompt for students. There is so much that could go into an assignment prompt for students that often doesn't go into it. So a conventional writing of prompt doesn't necessarily have things like the learning objectives clearly spelled out for your students, or maybe it doesn't give a clear rubric or a sense of how evaluation will be done before they get to that point in the assignment. So making sure that those things are upfront. This is the DAPO, the DAPOE framework that I mentioned earlier, can be really useful as well. All right, well, thank you so much for watching this with me. I know it's kind of long, but this is such an important issue that I felt like it was hard to cull down everybody's ideas. I wanted to touch on everything. So here I've got some resources for you with links that should be easily accessible for implementing online tech, lots for culturally relevant pedagogy and imposter syndrome. And then I also wanted to mention, although I mentioned it before, that some of the writers that I mentioned, some of the readings, I mean, that many instructors assign in order to help combat some of these issues, these are links straight to the PDFs. So that should be useful for you as well. Alrighty, well, thank you so much, everybody. And I hope this is helpful in terms of mitigating student anxiety in the writing process, but in the classroom more broadly speaking. So hopefully this is useful, and thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate it.